All right. Well, thank you all for coming to my final SIP presentation. I really appreciate it. And I think I have some great stuff to show you guys today. And yeah, let's get started. Today's presentation, I'm gonna go over 8 things basically. First, I'm gonna talk about where it all began and my humble beginnings at TP as a pianist and a composer. Then I'm going to talk about the initial idea I had and how this idea has changed. Then I'm gonna show you guys the first 8 pieces that I presented in November. And after that, I'm gonna talk briefly about what's happened since, unveil the new cover and the final list of pieces. And then we're gonna take a closer look at my most recent piece called Springtime. Finally, I'm gonna talk about what I think we should do with my project now and how the plans are changing because of the current situation with the coronavirus. So where it all began. This is a picture from my first TP performance in October, I believe, last year. And this is really what got me into taking music more seriously. I started playing piano at the age of 8, and after that I took lessons for about 5 years, and then I was kind of on off with piano because I played basketball at a high level. And other than here, you can only play club basketball in Germany, and my club happened to be at the other end of the city. So I didn't have much time besides playing basketball and driving to practice. Before I went to TP, I started taking music more seriously. My last 2 years of high school in Germany, I was part of the school orchestra as the pianist. Although I didn't enjoy that as much because I only played simple parts, chords, and as a pianist in an orchestra, it's sometimes not the greatest role to be in because you get yelled at if you make a mistake, but you never really get any of the credit because that goes to the other players. So when I went to TP, I started taking instrumental music classes with Mr. Kelsey, which was a class that I enjoyed immediately because it was a lot different from what I had known as a classical pianist from my training and from my time in the school orchestra, because we focused on improvising, which was something I really enjoyed. So that class was great to start off on. And I didn't take any music theory classes at first. It was Mr. Mead who got me to take them because I wanted to change from a physics class that I ended up realizing that I took the exact same class in Germany, and I was about to drop that class. And Mr. Mead suggested, why not take another class? And he said, I heard you're a pianist, right? So why don't you take music theory? So I ended up starting with music theory, which was hard in the beginning because there were only 2 people in the class, Oscar and Jason, 2 really talented guys, and they were already 4 weeks ahead of me. But I was in Mr. Templeton's apartment every night at first, doing some extra help, catching up on the stuff that I'd missed. And that was where I played him my first composition from Germany, Elegy for the Bike. And he was the one who suggested playing that in front of the whole school, which at that point I was really scared of because I didn't want to play in front of 300 people, especially something I composed myself. All the other performances I had prior to that were well-known pieces, but I didn't know how it was going to be received. It ended up being really well received, and it was a great experience to play. And since then, music was a way bigger part of my life at TP and in general. So the initial idea of my SIP came to me after my short weekend trip during long winter weekend last year when I went to Iceland, and I was really amazed by the beauty of Iceland, and I wanted to write a musical composition for piano inspired by Iceland. I think that's what I initially wrote on that paper and handed in to Mr. Reed, and that was what I was going to do. And I think when we left school, that was still my plan, write a piano composition inspired by Iceland. Over the summer, however, I realized that I was so much better and faster at writing music now because I didn't just play at the piano and something to come up while I improvise and sound good. I actually knew enough about music theory at that point that I could have something in my head and I knew what was going to sound good. So I ended up writing the Iceland piece first, which is still the longest piece on my album. It's about 7 to 8 minutes of piano solo, because at first I thought that was my only piece. I then started writing more music starting in August when I was in New York in between my basketball exposure camps. And I started to write a piece inspired by New York City, which, if you guys can remember, is the one I played in chapel for the Thanksgiving service, I think. So yeah, so over the summer I ended up writing about 5 more musical pieces, and I think I came back to school and told Mr. Reed I wanted to make a whole piano album, and it sounded a lot better than making just a composition. And I wanted to make this album be inspired by my experiences as a German kid coming to school in the United States and everything that had happened. So in November, I presented my first 8 pieces. The cover was the title slide of this presentation, and this was the back side. There was some drawings by me on like my different pieces and the inspirations behind them. The stolen bike was elegy for the bike, basically, and I just renamed it to fit better. The journey was a different genre, a lo-fi piece, basically just a beat with piano improvisation over it, like I had learned in Mr. Kelsey's class. The City That Never Sleeps, the piece that was inspired by New York City. Land of Fire and Ice was the Iceland piece that I also played the recording of that day. The last day was a piano and violin piece inspired by my feelings of going back to school, because I wrote it on the last day before my flight back in the summer. Autumn Rain was a really simple piano composition inspired by my view out of my dorm room in the fall, when I saw these beautiful trees on Clewid Road and it was raining. It was just such a nice vibe, and I wanted to catch that in my music. I think that was actually the quickest piece I've ever written, because I basically wrote that on one Wednesday after rec was over, and I sat down in my room and I just hammered away at the piano and got that song. And The Forest was my most complex piece at that point. It was a piece of piano, flute, and cello. And it was inspired by the forest right next to my house here in Germany, but also the forests at TP and behind the pond and everywhere else. And that was the newest piece before I presented at that point. And then Grandma's Wish really didn't have anything to do with TP or my experience here, but it was a song I wrote over the summer for my grandma, and I performed it in chapel for Christmas, and I wanted to put it on there as well. So it's not moving. Okay, what has happened since? A lot has happened since. I didn't write too much music right after the presentation because I was busy studying for SATs and getting my college applications in. But after that was over, at the start of this year, I started writing more music again, and I wanted to try orchestral stuff because I really got interested in doing music for films, and I rewatched a lot of Star Wars movies. I also did a research paper on the music of John Williams and how he uses different motifs to convey emotions, and that really got me into this idea of writing for orchestral music. The only problem was I really didn't know how to, and I didn't have the tools because all I had was my piano and my computer. So I met up with Gedney Webb, who is a film music editor in New York City, and he's done some amazing movies. And he came to TP and listened to some of my music, especially The Forest, which was my closest thing to orchestral music at that point, and he listened to some of my attempts at orchestral music. That didn't sound too great at that point because I didn't really have the tools. Like I said, I used like computer generated violins, and that was the main point he criticized, because I didn't have any control over the vibrato, the dynamics, and it all didn't sound too polished. So we had a great conversation about his process studying music at Kenyon, and then getting into film music editing and also composing. And he let me know what tools he uses in his digital audio workstation to create music for orchestras, it's called an orchestral mockup, and you basically use sampled instruments that are samples from instruments mapped onto a keyboard, and that way you can play them and program them so they sound like a real orchestra. So that's what inspired my last 4 pieces, 2 of which we played in virtual chapels, which are all orchestral pieces. And it's really the next step. It's a lot more complex than my piano compositions, and it has so many more layers to it. And this was really fulfilling for me, and I think you can do so much more with those, and it's so much fun to do these type of musical pieces. So I also thought I wanted to make this album really about TP, not about my experiences in the United States. I wanted to make it about TP because TP had done so much for me in my music. So the first step in that was to get a new album cover, which I asked Toby to do. And I really came to him before spring break asking if he could do a painting of Cluet and make that my album cover. That plan kind of changed with the current situation because he didn't have any supplies, but he was kind enough to still do it for me, and I think it turned out really great. So this is the new album cover. It's Cluet from the side, from the view of Route 22, with the sun rising up behind it. Toby is the one who came up with the title of Sunrise Over the Eastern Hillsides, which I think is really fitting because one of the songs on it is called Sunrise. And I talked to Mrs. Reed in the fall, and she wrote this verse in the alma mater of TP, which is Sunsets Over the Western Hillsides. So it seemed only fitting to make this album kind of contrasting to that and call it Sunrise Over the Eastern Hillsides. So these are my final 11 or 12 songs. I'm not exactly sure because I have removed some songs, but I still have 2 songs that I could put on there. But I will decide about that like in the next couple of days. The first ones are basically the same. Where It All Began is Elegy for the Bike, or The Stolen Bike. I just reworked that piece of music because I wrote it in 2016, about 4 years ago, and my skills have gotten so much better since then that I took my time here over spring break and I reworked it into a more complex piano composition. The Journey, The City That Never Sleeps are the same. A Winter Adventure is just renamed to fit the theme of TP because it was really a winter weekend adventure. The Last Day is the same. Autumn Rain is the same. I renamed The Forest to Behind the Pond because, especially from this year, I really realized that this space behind the pond, the forest there, and the new property became a place where I would go often during my concussion because it was really quiet and it really reminded me of my home. And so I changed that name to Behind the Pond, and I think it will be better for alumni or people related to TP to relate to the music more. Lights Out is my first try at orchestral music. Some of you guys might have heard this. I created it right before I left TP for spring break. I know Mr. Mead heard it. Mrs. Foster heard it. I'm not sure who else. Mr. Kelsey definitely heard it. And then Sunrise and Uncertain Times are the two pieces we played in Virtual Chapel. And Springtime is my newest addition and the final piece, which we will look at now. So now we're going to take a quick look at my creation process for this last piece, Springtime. You should see right now my screen having Logic Pro X open, which is the digital audio workstation that I use. And as you can see here, there are all different instrument tracks for this piece. In total, it's 48 tracks. And as most of you must have heard, it starts out with a piano. So you can see here in piano roll what the piano is playing. I'm not sure if you guys can hear this right now, but you should be. So this is this recording comes from me playing on my piano here. I have it connected to my computer. I will have to unfreeze this or take this piano really quick. So I basically play it in like that, and then it records it, and it records it in the form of MIDI and uses this software piano, which, as you can see here, is a plugin. It's called Cinepiano. It's a sound that I got from GetNeWeb. It's what most professional composers use for their Hollywood scores. It's a very nicely sampled instrument that really resembles a real piano. So most of my pieces, given that I'm a pianist, start out with me playing piano, and that is usually the way I start my pieces. I usually pick a key that I want to start in, and then I just start playing on the piano. Usually start with some chord progressions that I can come up with, and start improvising some melodies. And once I like them, I start writing them down either through recordings here or in the notation software Finale that eventually produces the score that you guys could all see through the link. So I start with this piano melody, and I wanted this piece to resemble springtime. So I chose to use woodwinds primarily because I thought woodwinds like flutes, oboes, clarinets, they really kind of resemble the sounds of birds chirping. So I start out with the piano playing up until here, and here you can see the flute solo coming in at first, doubling the melody from the piano. And at this point here is where the flutes come in. At first it was just a solo flute. After that, it's a flute section of 6 flutes playing in unison. And then as an accompaniment, we have strings here. And we have the choir, which I changed many times, but I ended up using a choir that is relatively simple, but adds some nice harmony in the background. So then the flutes play the melody at first, and then the clarinets come in playing a counter melody here. So if I choose the clarinets, they play a very simple counter melody at first, playing I don't know if you guys could see that, me playing there. That's what the clarinets are playing at first. And after that, we start with the wind chimes playing this nice little sound. And then it takes over with the strings playing the melody, actually the violin 1 playing the melody. And the clarinet that played the counter melody at first then switches to to bassoons playing the counter melody, and the horns here start arpeggiating the chords, and they are playing in very, very quietly at first, and there's a constant crescendo, which means that it's getting louder. So we can hear the horns really for the first time at this point, where also the oboes double the counter melody from the bassoons. So you can really hear the horns and the oboes come out in the second part of the melody. After that, we go to a really quick transition, and the upright basses, double basses, contrabasses, whatever you want to call them, play pizzicato, which means they are plucking their strings. And after that, we have the violins two, no, we have the violas and the cellos, I believe. I don't have the score next to me right now. Playing the chords in spiccato, which is just playing them shortly, not plucking them using the bow, but really short and hard sounds. And we have a solo violin playing different, it's basically the same concept of the melody at first, from the melody we hear at first, but it's in a more segregated way. It's in a lot of staccatos and marcatos instead of playing legato. Legato being playing everything smoothly and connected, and this being not so connected. We also have the bassoons playing staccato, the same notes that the double bass is playing, and we have the harp arpeggiating chords as well. That if you guys have the score open still, you can see that as well. Then after the melody is basically over, we have counter melodies at first in the clarinets, and then in the flutes and oboes, and then in the clarinets again. So after this part, we transition to a strings only part. And this part kind of, after the previous part being very, very uplifting and like playful, which I think always, at least from last year, I wish I could have experienced it this year. It's not possible, but last year we had these amazing afternoons and evenings playing softball on the quad, playing spike ball on the quad, just hanging out with the boys. And it was all very chill vibe, and that is reflected in this section here. Then the next section is the strings playing a more melancholic part of just strings, and then the vibraphone comes in to double the melody there. And finally, we go to the piano, and the piano is playing alone at first. And then we have the violins, the solo violin come back, this time playing legato, playing the melody from the very beginning, but in A major instead of G major. And we transition from the violin playing the first part of the melody to the cello playing the first part of the second part of the melody in solo. Then we go back to having the flutes play the melody, just like in the very beginning here. And we have the accompaniment in the strings and in the choir come back. So the strings briefly, the flute briefly plays the melody by itself, then the oboes and clarinets come in to double the melody and play in unison. And then I give the melody up to the horns playing in solo. And then the whole orchestra comes in for the final cadence here. And at the very end, I ended like usually like to end my pieces with the melody played in solo piano, very simply with the chords being held one chord per measure. And I actually decided to use the clarinet. So Mr. Mead, that answers your question from earlier. It's the clarinet playing solo in the end. And yeah, so that's basically the piece. So one thing that was different from pieces that I used to do before is I had a basic idea of this melody in my head and the harmonies. So that's how it started. And I used to have only flutes here, and only strings here. And then it kind of one instrument playing the melody at a time. There's someone trying to get in, Mr. Harf. And then I showed this to Mr. Templeton and Mr. Kelsey, and I basically had 95% at this point, and I wanted to add this little extra in the end. I tried a lot with the choirs, making them more complex, but I ended up not really liking the choir taking over counter melodies, because the choir was much too similar to the flutes and timbre. So I ended up choosing other woodwind instruments to use to do the counter melodies. And so I started to write the basic things down, and then I started to write them down in the notation and finale, and then I added counter melodies and finished off the piece over the weekend, and yeah, the last 5 days or so. So that was the creation process of Springtime. Now we come to my final slide. What now? At first, it was the idea to have this album sold in the school store as a classic CD, possibly with a download code inside for people that don't have CD players. And yeah, we wanted to sell the album in the school store, which we still can do after summer, possibly when school opens back up. But I had the idea to do something now to be able to help the current situation. So I haven't talked to anyone from communications yet about this, but I thought it would be a cool idea to have this album sold on the school website, for example, as a download, and people can download it as a file, as a folder with all these songs inside, and you could price it at, say, $15, with anything higher than that being accepted as donations, and giving 100% of the proceeds to COVID-19 relief. That I thought that might be a nice idea to help out in the current situation. I think I'm lucky to be in Germany right now because they're loosening up some regulations. It seems like it's sort of under control here, but the situation in New York and outside of New York up until Pawling seems to be not so great at the moment. So I thought it'd be nice to be able to do something on my part by putting the proceeds from this album into COVID-19 relief. So that was my presentation. I thank you all so much for being here and for listening. And I'll be happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Great job, Sam.
Thank you.
Great job, Sam.
That is, I'm flabbergasted.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right.
I do have a couple questions, but forgive me if they're silly. So if they're kind of linked, you mentioned that Jedney had taught you about a new program that sounded like it was better than when you were using before, and then you showed it to us with the Cinepiano. So is there a separate, I guess, is there like a Cine flute or a Cine clarinet that he would be using that then goes into Logic Pro, or are all of those, like the strings, are those all housed within Logic Pro?
That is a great question. So what I had at first was Logic Pro has sounds housed inside of it. You can see it here. The library, it has orchestral sounds, it has strings and everything, but they really don't sound great, and they're very, they sound like computer generated sounds. So that was what I used to use. And Mr. Webb gave me the suggestions of companies that make these samples, like Cinesamples being one with Cinepiano here. And those sample libraries work as plugins. So if I create a new instrument here, I can use the instrument, I can use the Contact plugin, which Contact is the software that houses these plugins. So I can create this instrument. And then these are all the libraries that I have at this point. This being Cinepiano, and I have these different choices of pianos. I also have Spitfire Audio's Albion 1, which is a full orchestra. It has the strings patches, the brass low, brass mid, all these things. That's what I started out on Sunrise and on Certain Times. For this piece, I thought that wasn't enough because you can't distinguish between having a clarinet or a flute or an oboe so much as you can with strings, because strings have different ranges, and you know if you're playing in the high register of the piano, it's going to be violins. If you play in the middle section, it's going to be a viola playing. But with woodwinds, they overlap. So I wanted to have the separate instruments. So I ended up investing in this plugin, Spitfire Studio Woodwinds, which has flutes, clarinets, oboes, bassoons, all that stuff. Then I also have percussion instruments, which has a ton of percussion instruments for orchestra. like timpani, and it has all these rolls and cymbal crashes that you can use. Also have Strings solo by the same company, and that's what I use for the solo violin, the solo cello part, because I really like the sound of piano and the solo cello, especially. I use that. I mean, I use it in like 5 pieces on my album, so I invested in those as well. So yeah, they're all separate plugins inside of Logic Pro, and uh, I didn't have any of those at first, but the more I got, the better they got.
Sam, how long did it take you to compose, edit, and finalize Springtime, for example?
That is a good question. It might have taken me longer than these other pieces because most music I either write during breaks, like sunrise and uncertain times, and I usually spend the entire day. With Springtime, not so much because I started after we already started school. So it took me maybe about 2 weeks or maybe a little bit more than that from the first idea I had to the final product. And like I said, I changed a lot of things. I replaced the generic flutes that I had at first with all these new flutes. I think when I showed it to Mr. Kelsey on Friday, I had all the generic woodwind instruments in there still. So I just acquired a new woodwind. So I recorded all these woodwind instruments, and I added the counter melodies. So I thought I was done a couple of times, and then I ended up not being done. Then I ended up seeing one more thing. Last night at 2 a.m., my mom comes up to me and she's like, I'm working on finalizing this presentation, and she comes up to me and she's like, Sam, there's this one note that you might have changed from the original one, but it really bothers me. So I ended up looking into it, and it was a grace note in the flute part, and I had not written it in my score. And since I re-recorded the flute, I thought there was a grace note there, which wasn't there. It didn't sound bad to me, but to someone who knew the original, it sounded wrong. So I took out that grace note and I bounced all the files over again and uploaded them to the Dropbox all over again for this one note. But yeah, that's happened a couple of times, but I always want to get it right. So
did you change that? Did you change that half note I talked about?
I didn't change the half note, but I added the counter melodies, so there's some more rhythmic interest.
That yeah, okay. Yeah. Oh, it might interest everybody that the way I'm teaching the kids now is a rudimentary system, an online version of more or less Logic, a digital audio workstation like that, and it's working pretty well. Of course, we're not doing anything nearly as sophisticated as Sam's did, but that's what we're doing now, and I'm going to incorporate that next year. It's working really well. Some kids that never really showed much interest or, frankly, aptitude for playing an instrument are really thriving in this environment. So I'm going to incorporate it next year, and I'm investing a lot of software and stuff so we can do something of what Sam did here.
I'm seeing Mr. Mead is raising.
Sam, I'm sorry for being a layman, but what is a grace note, and what is you use the term peggiating the chords?
All right, I will share.
I don't know what that means.
Okay, so where is it?
Am I saying the word right with the peggiating?
It's arpeggiating, almost.
Pagiating? Do we say pagiating?
Arpeggiating. No. Maybe Mr. Kelsey can write it in the chat.
Arpeggio.
So, yeah, like an arpeggio. So a grace note are these little notes with that are like on the piano. If I played it on the piano, it would sound like this. So in the beginning, I play. So instead of playing, can you guys see my piano right now?
Yep.
So instead of playing it
Yes.
straight like this, I grace this F sharp here. So I don't know if you can hear that. So that's a grace note. You basically just strike it really quickly, and it's sort of a decorative technique.
A little flip.
Exactly. And then an arpeggio. An arpeggio is basically you play a chord consisting of 3 notes, 4 notes, whatever, if it's a triad or not. So a G major chord would be like this, G, B, D. And if I arpeggiated this chord, it would be just me playing the notes like this. Or basically like, so I could play the chords like, that is basically what the horns are playing there. They're arpeggiating the chord.
Got it. Thank you.
No problem. I see you had some other questions in the chat. Can you, the album cover, say that the money will go to COVID-19 relief? Absolutely, I can put that text on there. I hadn't thought of doing that yet, but that's a great idea. And I have sent it to Mr. Webb, but I have sent a previous version to him, and he has not responded yet. That was, I think, a week ago. So I'm not sure if he got it or if he's just really busy at this point. Mrs. Steely.
Sam, this is just such, it's so excellent, and it's so exciting to watch how you know, have the idea and then how you bring the idea to life. And it's just been so fun to watch this whole thing and then have it all explained at the end. And I also want to give a shout out to the album cover artist. Excellent choice in choosing your album cover artist. It's really, I don't know, if I lost my internet early on several times, but great job. Great job.
Yeah, great job, Toby. I think he's talking about it in virtual Monday morning meeting this morning. So I wanted to leave explaining that to him this morning, but great job, and thank you so much, Toby.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, Mr. Taylor.
Well, first of all, Sam and Toby, you know, this is just unbelievable, as I said in the chat. What you've done is, you know, is beyond what I could have ever imagined. This initiative of a senior independent project being, you know, beyond what I thought could have happened. And so I'm just, you know, I'll use Mr. Harf's term, flabbergasted. You know, it's amazing. But, you know, I guess my question to you, Sam, and also to you, Toby, is, you know, this skill of improvisation, these creative skills, how have you, I'm just wondering how those skills have helped you adapt to these challenges. I mean, you've lost a lot. I mean, you were expecting to be hanging out on the quad this spring, playing softball, hanging out with the boys, and you know, you lost that. And I guess I'd love to hear from you, both of you guys, how the creative process, the ability to improvise has perhaps helped you through these challenges.
I guess I'll start really quick and I'll let Toby say something after. First of all, thank you so much. And I think in a lot of ways, what we're doing right now is improvising in a different way, not like you would improvise on a keyboard, but we are improvising. I'm improvising basically this presentation because I was going to play some live music for you guys or do something else. I wasn't planning in any way to do it over the internet and talk to a computer in my own room. But a lot of the stuff we've done here so far is improvising. for me and Toby, for the creative process, I think the first day of classes, we probably Zoomed like the entire day, like between classes, like during 5-minute breaks, we would hop on a Zoom, try some backgrounds and stuff like that. And then we've been texting a lot after school when it's already pretty late for me usually, but not so much for Toby. And then we would talk about things like this album cover. And we would send back and forth these, Toby would send me his new versions, and I would say, that's great. At first he had a really great picture, but it wasn't squared. And I said, well, for the album cover, it will have to be squared, and I don't want to cut off the sides of Cluid. So maybe you can adjust the picture so it's squared, maybe add a little sky on top. And he did that. And then we sent back and forth, like, I think like 8 album covers until we had it just right. But I think we've overcome these challenges. It's definitely not the same as being at TP, because it's always, I mean, just like hanging out in each other's dorms after study hall or something. There's nothing that can replace that. For me personally, I've had a lot more time to compose music than I would have at TP, because I don't have these things like hanging out with the boys. So I spend more time by myself doing music, for example. But yeah, like you said, this skill of improvising, I think in many ways we apply this every day. And even though it's not the same, like learning to improvise on a piano from Mr. Kelsey, and even on other instruments, like I'm starting to learn playing saxophone, and like right from the first note that I played, Mr. Kelsey started throwing me in there with all the other guys telling me to improvise, and I was like, whoa, I mean, I can barely play a scale yet. And but it's always some, like, you get out of your comfort zone and great things happen because of it. So I think that's how we overcome this, and that's why TP has really risen to this challenge so well. I don't know, anything to add, Toby?
Yeah, like back at school during art class, I had to improvise a lot. It was like when I had made a mistake or something on a painting, I had to improvise and using different techniques, and that's pretty much what I did. I had to use different programs since I don't really have that much painting supplies at home, so I had to kind of figure out what programs and softwares I could use to make a good cover for Sam. So that's basically what I did.
I have a question for both of you guys.
Mm-hmm.
How has the creative process kind of maybe filled some gaps or given you guys some solace over the past 6 or 8 weeks?
You want to start, Toby?
Yeah, well, making the album cover was pretty fun, actually. So I actually spent like one night for like 5 hours trying to get the Cluid building, because there are so many windows, and I had to like figure out from pictures where the windows were. But it was pretty fun, so it filled some time up, and I wasn't as bored as I thought I would be.
I want to give props to Toby first of all, because he wasn't totally not prepared to talk. I think he just thought he was going to watch a presentation and got up extra early before class to watch this. So thank you for doing this, Toby. And like I've already said in like the virtual chapels, like it's definitely filled gaps, because for me it's always been like that. I've dealt with losses, dealt with difficult times with sitting at the piano. Mr. Meaden knows about this because he helped me write my college essay, and he proofread a lot of essays that I wrote for colleges. And a common theme was me, when I felt empty, when I felt like I wasn't able to do things, when I had difficult times, I would sit at the piano and have a friend in the piano who would always listen to my thoughts and make it into something beautiful. I think that's how we put it in my Common App essay. So yeah, I think there's really no better way than art, be it visual art or music, to fill these gaps and turn it turn something negative into something beautiful.